All right. Welcome back, everyone, to the Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Jesse Collings. Joining me today is my neighbor to the west here, Joe Gagne. Joe, how are you doing today?
I'm great. Glad to be one of the seemingly 50 people from Massachusetts on the Voices of Wrestling staff right now.
Yeah, I would say I was thinking about this earlier today. Actually, I think the Voices of Wrestling staff is almost entirely comprised of people from New York, people from New England, and people from the Chicago area, or like if they're not, or like people from like the Milwaukee, Minnesota area. Like, do we have anyone on that staff who's like from California?
No one comes to mind.
I'm sure.
Everyone, yeah,
Yeah, I don't know the exact location of every single person, but it seems like everyone lives in like one of four places, which I is always leads to a lot of geographically similar discussion.
yeah, a lot of Boston sports talk and all that, and people in Chicago talking about the terrible weather last night when we recorded this. But yeah, it does tend to no one's piping in from like I don't know, like I don't think we have anyone like Florida or anything like that.
Yeah,
So
like the
we are,
Pacific Northwest, or
yeah,
I guess there's some people from Ireland, in a few UK based ones too. But it's very yeah, it's very limited geographically. We're lucky we're not in the territory days where we would only have like a perspective of like a few territories on staff.
yeah, we just
Uh,
covered the AWA and the WWWF with
yeah, that's the only two.
only be
Look, that's
discussed.
what all we would see. Unless we were like Dave Meltzer, we went on like vacation to our grandparents' house in Florida, so we could watch all of Florida wrestling or something like that, which is what Dave has said he does or said he did as a kid.
Yeah,
Um,
that always sounded so cool. Like you go on vacation and there's this whole other world of wrestling you probably didn't even know existed. Like maybe you had some rough idea that wrestling existed in other parts of the country, but here, like, and not just like random dudes. It's like the Hall of Famers like Dusty Rhodes. You can just go walk down the street and see. It's just I was kind of like I've been a wrestling fan a long time, so but I've always been kind of jealous of people who got to experience a territory like that, weekly show and that, the kind of the traditions and customs of having your own kind of localized sports. And when it was like basically professional sports, like in Tennessee or something, they didn't at the time didn't have sports teams. Wrestling was the kind of the professional sport. I always kind of feel like I kind of missed out on that in a way, but I've seen more wrestling than, but far too much wrestling, frankly, than most people. So I don't feel that bad.
yeah, it's really it's interesting because we're going to discuss Sting's career. That's why we're actually going to discuss. But I think this is actually somewhat an interesting point, given that Sting's career spans really the end of the territory era into the national era, and now into this broader kind of global era of professional wrestling that we've been in over the last decade or so. But it's a double-edged sword where on one end we have incredible access to pretty much any wrestling, like basically any wrestling match that happens now, you can watch pretty much, with the exception of like WWE house shows. Pretty much every single thing is recorded and broadcasted, um, and you can find it somewhere through legal means or through other means, and that's great for like information perspective. But there is like a certain level of charm to uh, like you could just go somewhere and discover like new pro wrestling, or maybe like you saw someone that whose name you read about in a magazine, and there's like a sense of wonder that's just lost in the internet age where everything is super accessible. And once you're at the stage of like where like you and I are in relative to like wrestling fans, like we can't really be surprised anymore, or it's much more difficult to surprise us with like something that's totally awesome or something that's totally cool, because chances are we've been hearing about it at least, or probably watching it for years and years.
Yeah, no, you would hear like, oh, this guy's great. And, you can probably go on YouTube and see something he did. Or like you said, there'll be a streaming site will have it somewhere. Not only have it, but it'll have it forever. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that was kind of I mean, I prefer being a wrestling fan today just because of the access of everything. Not only, is everything available, it's there in perpetuity. Like if I was a kid and I missed, I don't know, superstars for some reason, I had to go play baseball. I didn't set a VCR tape. It was gone. Like you would just never see it again. Like maybe if something noteworthy happened, it'd be recapped on another show. But just besides that, poof, it was gone. You would never ever see it again. And that is thankfully, if I miss, I mean, AEW is not really streaming right now, but DVRs make that a lot easier to kind of keep track of everything, and everything WWE does is gets put on their network one point or another. So you don't have that fear of missing out on anything, which is certainly an upgrade.
Yeah, it's definitely better to be a fan now, but there's a sense of wonder that's gone, I guess. A childlike wonder that comes to it. Because I mean, I certainly remember discovering like New Japan Pro Wrestling for the first time, and that occurred, in like 2000, like really, really discovering it for me. Like I had heard of it and had probably seen a match here and there, but like really getting into New Japan Pro Wrestling for me, I did in like 2012 or 2013. Where you could watch it on Ustream, and there was, you could watch a lot of matches on YouTube and things like that, but still getting into it for that first time.
Yeah,
Like
I mean,
this discovering this whole new world of professional wrestling that you had never really watched before. And you can't really recapture that.
no, I mean, I remember reading the aftermags in the early '90s talking about what was going on in Memphis, and it just sounded like the coolest thing. But there was no way to see it. There was no way to experience it whatsoever. And even when I first got on the internet in '95, and everyone's talking about ECW, and there wasn't, I would just read text descriptions of shows, and they sounded like awesome. But I didn't even know what anyone looked like. Never mind, matches or clips being posted. So yeah, that has gone in a way. We've traded it for accessibility, which is probably a fair trade in the end. But as always, you kind of lose something with these technological advances.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk about Sting today, and that's obviously the title of this episode is going to be "It's Sting," like Tony Schiavone famously says. And the reason I have Joe on the show today is because Joe is without giving away ages, Joe is of a different generation than me. As people know, I am not particularly old in terms of wrestling fandom. Uh, and I was, as I tell people frequently, I was 6 years old when the Monday Night Wars ended. I have absolutely zero recollection of Sting in WCW firsthand experience. I didn't even know what WCW was when it closed. Um, so my familiarity with Sting, like watching him as a performer, is really him in TNA. That's when I first saw my first Sting match. That's when I first found out who Sting was. And subsequently, I've been able to go back and watch all of the pivotal matches and moments of his career and be able to understand his career in the way that someone who is going back and watching it can understand it, which is of a limited perspective, but is one shared by pretty much everyone of my generation. Joe, on the other hand, you go back much further with the Stinger, and you said, I think you told me that your first kind of memory of seeing Sting was the famous Clash of the Champions match with Ric Flair.
Yeah, I didn't see that live, but I kind of knew of Sting. My relationship with the NWA at the time and WCW, it was always interesting. I was always more of a WWF guy because they always came to Massachusetts. They were always around. They'd always be plugging a show at the Garden, talking about coming to Boston and things like that. And WCW never really ran up here all that much. They ran some shows in the Garden like once a year in the '80s. They had a couple random shows in Worcester. Even during the Monday Night Wars, they didn't run a ton.
Wasn't Slamboree '98 at the Worcester? Was that the
Yes,
DCU Center or
it
what?
was. Yeah, that was the DCU Center they ran, and they ran some notable. I think they ran a pay per listen at in Boston. I think January '98. I think something like that. So they had a couple shows, but it's not like they were here all the time. I just always felt a closer kinship with the WWF, and it was a little bit harder to watch, the 605 show because it was on cable. And I know as a kid we only had one TV with cable, and my dad was always like, "I'm watching the Red Sox." Like, I don't really care. You want to watch wrestling? That's fine. Because he, was a steel worker who worked hard and wanted to watch the Red Sox. So, it could be a little difficult to find the time to check it out. So I never felt as close, but I would watch, as much as I can. And yeah, I would see, I distinctly remember Sting in the late '80s and certainly all throughout the '90s.
Yeah, I watched almost all wrestling as a kid on my parents' little TV in their bedroom. Because like when it was on during prime time, like I'm not hoarding the living room TV and watching wrestling. But we at least had two TVs with cable. But yeah, that's funny. That's a true anecdote. But he so like Sting. So my relationship with Sting, as I detailed, like not seeing him until TNA, was when he was in TNA. Um, while there are ups and downs of his run in TNA, I will say he was always presented as a star and always treated and revered like he was a big deal. So for me, as an adolescent, as a kid, watching him, I understood that this guy Sting was a main event wrestler, someone who had a lot of experience being a big star. And as I became like a teenager and I got access to the internet, and I began reading a lot of books and watching, DVDs and things like that. It became apparent to me that, Sting was this huge star in the 90s and a huge star in WCW. Um, and I was able to kind of, start my education going back and watching his matches. And I understood all of that. But as just a fan, I didn't really like Sting. I didn't really get it. I understood there was nostalgia there, but it was other people's nostalgia. It wasn't mine. And that's a hard thing I think sometimes we dismiss with nostalgia acts in a lot of cases where it's great. Like I always would say this, when The Undertaker's career was winding down, was like The Undertaker, especially when his mobility just totally cratered. Like The Undertaker, if you're like a 10-year-old kid or if you're like 14, The Undertaker is some like geriatric grandpa who can't move and has this absurd gimmick that nobody has any. And I don't know how popular he is with people of that generation. He's getting by solely on his nostalgia. And Sting is obviously in better physical shape than Undertaker, but that was kind of my impression of Sting when he was in TNA was that, yeah, I could accept that he was a big star, but I don't care about this older guy. I want to see the younger wrestlers who are innovating and who are pushing things in a new direction and people that I feel like reflect closer to my generation and not this old nostalgia act. And TNA was really insistent consistently on pushing him as a top act and pushing him as a main event star, even as he got older and older. I remember he main evented a pay-per-view that I went to. It was Slammiversary. I want to say it was Slammiversary 2014. I might have that wrong, but it was at the Agganis Arena in Boston, and he main evented against Bully Ray in like a no DQ match. And I remember just being like, I don't know why I'm watching these two guys who are one guy is in his 50s and one guy I think was in his 40s in Bully Ray. These guys have a combined age like in their 90s. Um, and I don't really know why I'm watching these guys. And why can't we get something else? Because it's just the same show that had wrestlers like AJ Styles and Chris Sabin, um, Austin Aries and Bobby Roode and all these guys were on the show, but it was Bully Ray and Sting who were in the main event. This was Slammiversary in 2013. And it was just one of those things where I just didn't really care about Sting, and I was kind of sick and tired of seeing him. And that was kind of my relationship with him up until very recently.
I've always kind of wondered with younger fans, like, I mean, my generation of fans, the folks who grew up, watching wrestling in the 80s, the Hulkamania boom and all that, and saw the Monday Night Wars, were kind of like the baby boomers of pro wrestling fandom, where everything has kind of been, cultivated to our taste over the last couple of years. How much nostalgia has, WWE pulled out for the Monday Night Wars and even the Hulkamania era, and people aren't getting newer fans aren't getting their own experiences. Everything is kind of still catered around our fandom. I think that's changing a bit now. So I was always just curious for wrestling in the past, like how much of it, like, did you care at all? Did you think like, well, I have to experience, I have to see every pay-per-view, or did you just beyond like a knowledge of history? Did it interest you at all beyond that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I'm relatively unusual in that I have like a really intense want to understand wrestling history and to want to like go back and read and watch things from decades ago. And so I think I talked about this with Garrett Kidney when I had him on my show a couple of like last month. But I like when my teenage years were spent largely like getting DVDs of old WCW pay-per-views and old WWF and WWE pay-per-views and watching them and I read a ton of books, detailing the 90s and the 80s and biographies and things like that. So it always really interested me, but I would also say that I have an unusual interest both in the history of things and also certainly for pro wrestling. But I would imagine you're kind of typical regular young person fan. Probably not. They're probably not that interested in it. And it probably does depend on how someone is presented. There's a way to present a nostalgia act that is cool to a younger generation. I'll tell you, in some ways, ignorance is bliss. When I was a kid, I enjoyed the Legion of Doom reboot with Road Warrior Hawk, Road Warrior Animal, and Heidenreich. Like I enjoyed that because the Legion of Doom were cool. They were like these big guys with shoulder pads and face paint. They came out and they wrecked people. And I didn't really care that it wasn't Road Warrior and Hawk because it wasn't Road Warrior Hawk wasn't in it. And it was Heidenreich, who's infinitely less talented than Hawk was. I just liked the gimmick and it worked for me. And obviously, older fans that remembered the actual Road Warriors were like, "This is ridiculous. Why is Heidenreich wearing this face paint in the Hawk shoulder pads?" It was super dumb. Uh, but as a kid, I didn't know any better, so it was cool to me. So there is a way to kind of present the nostalgia acts in a cool way, and I imagine each one is going to be different depending on how they're presented and kind of how each fan reacts. I don't think it can be determined like one way or the other.
Yeah, I didn't really care for that because I remember the original Road Warriors, and I thought like,
Right,
oh,
like
it's kind of
it's absurd now. Even if I go back and I can watch, I can say this was bad. But as a kid, what made the Road Warriors interesting to kids who were seeing them for the first time in the '80s? That still worked for me when I was a kid in 2005 when I was 11 years old and they came out did that stuff.
no, that makes sense. Like there wasn't really any kind of like pro wrestling pretty much reset when Hogan won the belt in '84. They didn't the '70s, may as well not have existed. They weren't trotting out, Baron McKill Cicluna for, an appearance during Superstars or anything like that. So I never really had to kind of navigate that,
Yeah,
someone else's nostalgia.
you mentioned that like how like wrestling has catered towards nostalgia and the Attitude Era and things like that. And like if you go back in time, it's like it would sound absurd. Like if you bring out an Attitude Era act right now in 2023, you brought out somebody who was big in 1998, just 25 years ago. That would be like in 1998, bringing out somebody from like the late 1960s, right?
Yeah, trotting out like Ivan Koloff or something like
Yeah,
that, and it would just
yeah,
be like, well, who cares? Like I may have had a vague knowledge of him, but like, all right, that means nothing to me.
right. And they would look bad, and it would be like this
Yeah,
this whole thing. But um, there's legs for that kind of nostalgia, and this is true across all of media. Uh, it's not just limited to wrestling in terms of what we see rebooted and what we see kind of repackaged and things like that. But it definitely is an element. And Sting, because he's wrestled pretty much consistent, has been a huge part of that because uh he has not, outside for a period of time, first when he left TNA and before he came to WWE, and then when there was the period of time in between WWE and his debut in AEW. And obviously there was the period between WCW closing and him signing with TNA. But for pretty much the most part, he's been a really consistent performer. He's been a consistent presence in multiple wrestling promotions over that time period, to different results, I'd add.
yeah. No, I think Sting is always interesting to me. For the period of time I watched him, he always kind of tended to wrestle to the level of his opponent. If he's in the ring with Vader or Ric Flair or Cactus Jack, he would have excellent, awesome matches. If he was in the, if he was having a match with like Meng or something, it would be like, oh, okay, that was all right. Like, it's just someone who kind of, I remember a lot of like watching a lot of matches and thinking, wow, Sting really carried that there too. He was a guy who, he would usually put in a good performance. He didn't really sting out the place, but very much dependent on who he was in the ring with in terms of that. And I think that, I think that kind of changed around TNA. I wasn't a diehard TNA fan, but I think Sting kind of became a more consistent performer and certainly a much better promo in
Right.
TNA, which is, it's funny. That's like learning to hit the curveball in time for the old timers game at Yankee Stadium. Like, it's good you're you learn that skill, it's not going to do you a world of good right now because TNA, it was just at that point there's really nothing anyone could do to really boost that,
He didn't
their
really have to
profile.
become a good promo in TNA.
No, I know he
Like,
didn't, but he did. So it's just funny. Like where was this like
well, that was
all those
like
years ago?
Goldberg. Like Goldberg became a good promo like during his last few years in WWE when he came back like in his 50s. Like suddenly Goldberg was like a compelling promo, mainly because he was allowed to talk not like a robot and just sound like a regular person, which stands out in WWE today. But that
True.
was the whole thing. It
Yes.
was like, oh, Goldberg is suddenly like a compelling promo, um, which was not really his strong suit during
No.
his actual prime.
No, it was not.
Uh, well, I think wrestling has changed, and like you mentioned, like he would wrestle to the level of his competition, and during the 80s and the 90s, and certainly in WCW, there were a lot of people who, from a work rate standpoint, especially at later stages of their career, just could not cut it anymore and would not be able to cut it today, because the standard is so much higher. And so you throw Sting in there with just like a lot of guys who maybe aren't going to uh, put on a compelling in-ring performance, and the onus is kind of on Sting to carry everything, and that's kind of hard to do often, especially with the as a career babyface, where there's only so much you can do during like late stage career Meng's control period, like as a babyface to kind of get that over. Um, and so I think as he went to TNA, oftentimes the level of worker was higher, maybe not quite as high as it would be today, but he was working with a lot more consistently good wrestlers. And then certainly since he's been in AEW, he's pretty much only worked with good wrestlers, and that's helped certainly.
Yeah, it is funny that his highest level of quality competition is at this stage of his career, which is you know a time period which most wrestlers have long since retired.
Right. Well, I would say wrestling in general, like if you were to look at like the average in-ring quality is kind of, for the most part, and obviously it depends on your preferences and things like that, but for the most part has gone up in a pretty consistent pattern since he first broke into wrestling. Um, Maybe you could argue like him breaking into WCW in the late 80s and then certainly early in the early 90s was better than like WCW in like 1998, 1999 as from an in-ring perspective and as far as like who the top stars were and if they could work or not. But um, certainly in general, like your average main event level wrestler is a better person than in the 80s or 90s, especially if you look at like the places Sting worked.
Yeah, I mean, there's no one out there who's like really like awful, like bottom of the barrel, just like embarrassing
No, and that's
to be
something
out there these days.
if you go back and if you like watch older stuff today, or even if you read like the Observer back issues where Dave is like giving out star ratings for um an old, a 1993 WCW pay-per-view or a 1996 WWF pay-per-view, like there's just like a lot of one-star matches and there's just a lot of like bad stuff. And that's why like 2.5 stars is considered an average match. Today, I would almost consider it to be disappointing for pretty much any match, because, despite it technically being an average rating. But that's because the standard is so much higher.
Yeah,
And there's just
there's no Iron Sheiks out there, like rest in peace, but like who Sting had a pay-per-view match on in the I think like 88, 89,
yeah,
and
like
just that level where like this guy can't be on TV anymore. He's
right.
atrocious.
And part of that is guys take better care of their bodies.
Yeah.
The travel isn't nearly as bad. Modern medicine, modern training techniques, modern rest, and things like that. So guys don't fall off cliffs the way like and the Sheik is a good example. Like the Sheik's like the cliff he falls off of physically is like incredibly remarkable. But was also was also a pattern many people fell from when they go from being a good worker to just totally being unusable very quickly, because the way they took care of themselves and the way that the wrestling lifestyle was, you weren't able to age gracefully for the most part.
No, you would age overnight because you had a schedule that just ground you into oatmeal, in in no time flat, and then you take drugs to deal with it, and yeah, it was just a mess. So
Yeah, well,
I mean, yeah,
you get an injury and you'd have to keep working even with the injury, because if you weren't working, you weren't making any money. Um, and then so you would, all it would take would be, one injury to your back or one injury to your knee or one injury to your neck, and you're in the circle of hell where you're working injured, so you injure something else, and then you physically just become shot, and all of a sudden you're relying on a comedy gimmick, or you're taking no bumps in a match and having a 1-star match. It's basically what would happen to pretty much everybody, which again
Yep.
makes Sting's the fact that he's still wrestling in 2023 pretty remarkable.
Yeah, Sting. I mean, Sting was a guy who did always work hard. Like he would do like sometimes crazy dives to the floor. He worked a pretty athletic style for a main eventer, and so he's shown remarkable durability for
Yeah,
just someone who was around for all those periods.
yeah, as like a worker, like in his prime, or even if you're going to talk about like young Sting, like the famous Clash of the Champions match with Ric Flair, and kind of his original Surfer Sting peak run in WCW, like he kind of reminds me of, and this is a funny comparison, especially for me, but he kind of reminds me of Roman Reigns in that he's a really good athlete, and he's got a good look, and he moves around the ring like an athlete, and he comes across as kind of explosive. He's not like a technically great wrestler in the sense that some of like the true greats of technical wrestling. He's not like Ricky Steamboat out there, but he's capable of having good and exciting matches thanks to his athleticism and this aura that he's kind of a top guy, which he kind of always had.
It it is funny, like Sting was kind of a disappointment on top for years and years, much like Roman Reigns, which it is funny if you kind of look at
He
Sting
got
and
pushed for 10 years and then finally moved business, just like Roman Reigns.
yeah, it's like it's so funny because if you look anytime Sting was really made the man in WCW, like here's the belt, you're the guy, it would usually be taken away within months, if not sooner. And it was like, he wins the belt in 1990. It was, him and Warrior win the belts of their respective companies in 1990. You think, oh, these are the new guys. It's a new decade. We're turning the page. And then they give Sting the horrendous Black Scorpion angle. That it's just it's just horrendous. It just kills us right off the bat. And Flair's champ by January. And then I think like 92, he beats Lex Luger for the belt, Super Brawl. And, Flair, Sid, and Luger, they're all gone. It's just kind of Sting, and he loses the belt to Vader in like 4 months because they wanted to transition to Ron Simmons. And then Sting wins the belt in '97 against Hulk Hogan as the peak of WCW, the biggest thing they ever did. I watched that match. I went back and watched that match in preparation for this because I was so curious, and I just could not believe how badly they fumbled that. It was just I couldn't believe it. Sting was done that night, and he was never really in the title picture again. I think he had a couple quickie runs, but
Yeah, like what you would say, he loses the title to Randy Savage like in March of
yeah,
1998. Like he has it for, and that's something that like people don't almost like. Everyone kind of remembers the whole angle. He didn't face Hogan for a year. He barely wrestled. They showed him up in the rafters, and they did this incredible job keeping them apart and then building it up towards um the major event. And then they do it. It sets the record for like highest buy rate in history. Does incredible business, and then like Sting's kind of done as a top guy after that, which
yeah.
is
I mean, Hogan just like beats him up a good chunk of the
mhm.
match. They like Nick Patrick either forgets to count fast, or I think Bischoff just kind of said on one of those A&E specials like Hogan pulled a creative control card. I'm not sure if that's, but the finish is screwed up.
You think Eric Bischoff would lie on a thing
Or
about a mistake that was made in WCW, or he would
yeah,
shirk responsibility for it?
yeah. Well, I'm, I always said Eric had like one of the great executive years in like 1996 because the WCW made incredibly bold decisions and it paid off wonderfully. And then it's been the last quarter century. So, I do have some respect for him, but yeah, I don't really care a ton what he
Right.
has to say right now.
So, so
Yeah. So
and
yeah, it's just, oh,
you
go ahead.
mentioned like his disappointing kind of drawing career, the lack of opportunity, the lack of consistency, and like him like having a long title reign and drawing big on top. Um, were you? I was not a Wrestling Observer newsletter Hall of Fame voter when Sting was on the ballot. I've only been voting for the past few years, and I believe uh, he got in the year before I started voting. Um, But were you a voter? Because I believe you have a ballot. Were you a voter when Sting was on the ballot? And did you vote for him when he got in?
I did not vote for him when he got in. I was just kind of always pressed, like, the guy's not really a Hall of Fame worker. The guy wasn't a Hall of Fame promo at his peak, and he was kind of a disappointment on top. So I wasn't like, opposed to the guy. I didn't think Sting had like a terrible career or anything. I just thought like there was a kind of a tinge of disappointment to it. And how can you really vote someone into the Hall of Fame if they're a disappointment? Like same thing with the Warrior at the time. Like, Warrior had these runs, but ultimately you look back and it's like that wasn't nearly what we thought it was going to be. So I wasn't a voter on Sting. I wasn't all that, I was like, I kind of got it. Like, the guy was a, a big pushed act for at times the biggest company in wrestling. So it was like, I guess, people would always say things like, oh, Sting was a big conduit for, kids getting into wrestling. And it's like, well, where were they? Because, Sting was popular, he got cheered, but you look at the crowds, like in 1992, like WCW averaged less than 2,000 fans per live event. Like, were they all, they used to say like, Sting's getting paid all this money and the fans are dressed up like empty chairs. So I wasn't a voter for him. I wasn't like threw my hands up when he got in because I kind of understood, but looking at now and what he's done in AEW, it seems kind of churlish to be upset about that. Like given say a whole new generation is like super into Sting now. It's like, well, maybe everyone else was onto something here.
Right, and I want to get into that because while I wasn't a voter, I agreed with your arguments for not voting for Sting. That was my kind of disposition as well, in the sense of he's really famous, like he's really well known. More people know Sting like across the country than they would know like Ivan Koloff, um, or some people who did get in, before him. But I agree. Like, he was kind of like the perception that Sting was the top guy in WCW for like the entire 90s is incorrect. He was constantly being replaced by someone else who they felt like would do a better job. Now, how much of that is on Sting and how much of that is on just a revolving door of creative, leading to Eric Bischoff taking over the company and Bischoff himself kind of having scatterbrained ideas for who was going to be a top guy and never really settling on Sting. And
Yeah,
so,
I was going to say, Sting certainly does not bear all the blame for that. Like I said, they gave him terrible angles for his first reign, and he was just kind of pushed aside at other points. But I think he bared a little. He has to bear some of that burden for not really. You can say wrestling was down in the early 90s. It certainly was, but part of being a big star is kind of turning business around, and Sting never did that on his own. It wasn't until Hogan came in and Savage that WCW was really any kind of big success.
right, and that big argument is like Hogan and Savage come in, Roddy Piper comes in and does huge business as like a top baby face. Then they get Hall and Nash and NWO Angle and all that kind of stuff, Goldberg. Um, but so I agreed with all that, and then so you mentioned like his AEW run like makes those concerns that you previously had seem insignificant, which is interesting to say because it's not like Sting has been a massive business draw for AEW. It's not like, they're selling out arenas across the country because Sting is there. And it's not like his television ratings, are huge. They did one of their worst ratings in recent time period for his match against Chris Jericho a couple of weeks ago. What makes you think about Sting's? What makes you think uh, Sting's run now? Like, how does that actually change your mind?
Well, you'd think it's being brought in at this age and whatnot. You'd think, oh, it's kind of a cash grab. When Sting came in, I don't think anyone had any real expectations of him contributing. Like, oh, maybe he'll have a match or two. He's still in relatively good shape, and he's been certainly not. I mean, he's worked a bit more regularly than I would have guessed given his age and all that. But the guy, and this is someone who kind of got into wrestling. He was a bodybuilder, and everyone always said like he didn't love wrestling. This was an opportunity to make money and have the fame, and he stuck with it. Not really a guy who loved wrestling, but he is out there, and he is just like at times literally killing himself every week doing these crazy bumps and working so hard in these matches and having I remember last year's Forbidden Door, like teaming with Shingo and all that. Like that's crazy. And people just go nuts for him. And he's really helped Darby a lot. Like, when they were paired up, it was like, oh, I guess that makes sense. But I think it's worked out a lot better than anyone would have guessed, because I think it's helped Darby a lot. And it certainly helped Sting too. At the same time, it's been this symbiotic relationship. And I don't know, like I have a lot of very weirdly very fond memories of Sting and AEW, because like I said, the guy just works so hard when he really doesn't have to.
Right. But that's not really like a Hall of Fame credential to me. Like he's been an asset to AEW and he's been enjoyable. But when we look at the Hall of Fame, when we look at like drawing power, and like even in-ring work and things like that, I wouldn't say that he's necessarily done that in AEW.
No, and let me just say that if Sting was not in the Hall of Fame and we were considering it, I don't know how much AEW would lend to it. This might be the case that, well, he got in, there's nothing I can do about it, and I'm just kind of enjoying this late period of him where, like I said, he's working so hard when he really doesn't have to, and putting on very memorable matches and being popular with possibly a whole new set of fans, kind of just it enhances it to me. I'm not saying like this would put him over the edge if he was still
Right.
up for the Hall of Fame. I think it's because it's fait accompli. It's just kind of a nice postscript to his career where,
Yeah.
like, how can you be mad at Sting?
Yeah,
It just seems silly.
as I've detailed, I was not like a fan of Sting, when I would see him in TNA, and I didn't care at all when he showed up in WWE, and I don't think they used him properly at that point either. And when he showed up in AEW, I was like, really, Sting? Like, I get there's older fans that are like, I love Sting, I'm a Stinger, like, and those fans are getting, so I got it, but I wasn't particularly excited to see him. And like I said, I was not really an enthusiastic Hall of Fame supporter of him as well. Um, but his time in AEW, and maybe it's just me getting older and wiser in terms of the business, but his time in AEW has really hammered home something to me in that I can quibble about his drawing ability, or I could quibble about his lack of truly great matches, or these things we often talk about in terms of the Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Fame. But to me, what really is hammered home is this guy is a big star and he understands how to be the star, and in a way that like very few other people do. And even though he is 64 years old, and I like I said, I have no nostalgia for Sting at all. I'm like, this dude gets it. And this dude is what I think about when I think of like a true wrestling legend. Because and part of it is used in a very careful, conservative way that totally plays to his strengths. And the other is just his total enthusiasm for working the crowd today and doing what is necessary to get over and to stay over. Because we're on what? He came in like 2020, December 2020,
I believe so. Yes.
right? So we're closing in. We're on 2.5 years of him being in AEW, wrestling, like you said, probably more frequently than you thought. And he's still just as over as he ever was. And people are into it. And to me, he's really hammered home something that I was kind of discounting previously, which is just this aura and this credibility that he has as a top star that I think very, very few people have. Um, and that to me, like, it's not a scientific analysis. It's not talking about drawing figures, and it's not talking about, you know, Fred Moreland does a great job with like the Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Fame voting award shares and things like that. It's there's nothing analytical about this, but when you see him and you watch him in the ring and you watch him at age 64 wrestling with guys a third of his age, you see a guy who's a Hall of Famer. Um, and it really has been hammered home during his time at AEW. And I've been able to appreciate him so much more. And maybe that's just because I like AEW more than I ever liked TNA. Maybe it's just an inherent anti-TNA bias against myself. But it feels that way to me, just me as a viewer, as someone who didn't grow up with Sting or anything like that, that he's just this level of iconic figure in wrestling that should be celebrated. And I have absolutely nothing bad to say about him.
No, I don't think anyone could say anything bad about this most recent run. And I think for fans of my generation who saw Sting in WCW, and this feels like a very nice victory lap of sorts. Like here's a guy, you know, WCW went under. He went to TNA. You know, he does very good work in TNA, but no one's really watching it. No one is just kind of like, everyone's kind of like, all right, like that's fine. He
Like,
does go.
what were his most memorable TNA moments?
I mean, in a bad way. I remember the Jeff Hardy
The
match where
the
Jeff
Victory
was,
Road Jeff Hardy moment, right?
yeah, and yeah, I don't know, probably one of his, I guess one of his title wins, none of which really jump out at me right now.
Right. And I'm not like a TNA historian or anything like that. So I'm probably forgetting about some stuff, but I don't know. It seems like in kind of the nature of TNA, like a lot of the results and major moments are relatively forgettable. Um, and maybe it's because it's more recent, but I can like identify like many different things that happened in Sting's AEW career. Um,
Yeah, so I like, he was a guy like TNA run was, not, he did good work. It was, a run to be proud of, but nothing really sticks out. He goes to WWE, he has like, he finally kind of gets there. He has the WrestleMania match against Triple H. He loses, and like the NWO shows up for some reason, and
sucks. It's the whole
yeah,
thing
it's just
sucks so
like,
much.
yeah, it's just like, oh, so, but here
Like
he is.
the,
Oh, go
the
ahead.
the NWO, they turned Sting into like a WCW mascot, and so it had
Yeah,
to be like a WCW versus WWF. Like basically what they should have done during the invasion, but they're doing it like 20 years after the fact. And like, you know, DX runs out, which is just Triple H's friends. Then NWO runs out, which is more of Triple H's friends, but for some reason they're siding with Sting. Like they're not even the NWO Wolfpack; they're just the regular black and white NWO. It was completely absurd.
yeah, who hated Sting, so I don't know why they're helping him out. But yeah, but so after all that, this guy gets one last run in a major company, and he's killing it. And like you said, you can't say anything bad about what he's done. He's helped. He's worked hard. He's done great work, and it's just an unqualified, certainly a bigger success than any of us would have guessed when you heard Sting's coming in.
Right. Well, Sting was coming in, and you mentioned like, oh yeah, he's probably gonna wrestle. Like, I mean, for me, I was like, can Sting wrestle? Like, because he had, he basically had to retire because he had
Yeah,
spinal
that's true.
stenosis, and we had no idea. And I remember like there was this whole thing about like, is Sting gonna be able to wrestle? Can Sting take a bump? And then there was like, I think Brian Cage gave him a power bomb, and I was like, oh my god, Sting took a power bomb! Like, oh my god, he's got spinal stenosis. Like, he shouldn't be taking the power bomb. And they had, the cinematic match with Darby and Sting versus was it Cage and Will Hobbs, Cage and Ricky Starks? It was against Team Taz.
Yeah, the team. Yeah, I think it was Team Taz.
Yeah, they did the cinematic match, which obviously is smoke and mirrors, and you can hide, you know, anything. He doesn't really have to take any real bumps. It was like, okay, they could do that. But since then he's had batches, he's taking bumps, he's jumping off of things, he's out of his mind. He's he's crazy. He's a
Yeah,
crazy man, and he's doing it. He can't be doing, and he's doing it like, I'm sure he's being paid well in AEW, but even if he's not being paid well to like jump off a ladder. Like he's being paid well to be Sting and to slap on the Scorpion Deathlock and to, you know, give the Stinger Splash and all things that don't require him to like almost die. Uh, and I guess he hasn't almost died, but um, he's given way more physically than I think anyone could have possibly have imagined when he first showed up at AEW, which is part of I think why he's gotten over so much.
yeah. Didn't 2.0, didn't they put him through a table or something? I think he took like a hideous bump there. That was like, oh my god, like what are you doing, Sting?
He
But
was
no, yeah,
Yeah, he wrestled on the Forbidden Door pay-per-view. And there was like I think like Sammy was giving him a 630 through the table, and Sting got up, and like after that he was kind of hobbling around a little bit, and everyone was like, oh my god, is like Sting okay? Because he's so old, so people are kind of have their antennas up when it comes to him, if he's whether he's just selling or he's actually a little banged up or things like that. And there was this concern for Sting, and then 4 days later he was jumping off a ladder out of the ring through a table.
yeah, and a long way away too.
Oh
From,
my god, when he so Darby set up that spot on Dynamite, Darby sets up. So you see Sammy's like on the table, and Darby sets off the ladder in the ring, and I was like, "Geez, that's like far. That's going to be a far jump for Darby." And then Sting is like, "No, well, I got this." It's like Sting can't jump that far. I don't even know if Darby could, who's again like less than half of his age. And I mean, he just barely made it, but he did it, and he, from what I can tell, is not significantly injured.
Yeah, I mean, I think he got he like lost a tooth or something like that, but he was still fine and still going. So he is a miracle in a variety of different ways.
And I think about like, um, there's something about like I said, his presence and his star power. Like I remember you mentioned like he had the tag match with Shingo in the 6-man tag at Forbidden Door last year. And Shingo gave an interview where he just talked about like being in the ring with Sting and like watching him be a star, watching him exude star charisma. And I don't know what Shingo Takagi's like nostalgia or knowledge of Sting was prior to that match. I'm sure he maybe recognized him and knew what he was, but I don't know if Shingo Takagi was a little stinger growing up in Japan. But to have a veteran, star wrestler in his own right be like in the ring with a guy and be like, that guy knows how to be a star. That guy understands what it means to be a top guy and how to perform like that. Kind of hammers home what I think has become evident to me as a fan, which is that this is a special, legendary figure in wrestling, which I was before pretty dismissive about him. I was like, I could never see Sting wrestle a match again, and I wouldn't feel like I'm missing much. And now I'm like, oh man, I hope Sting keeps wrestling.
Yeah, yeah. You hope, you hope he gets to 40 years. We think, and it's not like Shingo has like he just wrestled in tiny feds. Like he's been in front of big crowds. He's been around, and to be kind of in awe of Sting really speaks to Sting's.
Yeah, it's not like a young boy being like, "Oh,
No,
this guy's a big star." It's like, no, Shingo is, a big star in his own right, and is, former IWGP World Champion and top guy in Dragon Gate for years and years. But he that kind of perspective, I think, hammers home that point about Sting's viability as a top guy.
mm,
And just this is something I think about a lot. In I think the way the business was when Sting was coming up and when Sting first broke through as a top guy, and kind of the cachet that came with being a main eventer and being a world champion, and why it was so important to be protected. That's kind of lost. The business is more egalitarian in a lot of ways now than it was back in the 80s and 90s. And to an extent, I do think that like there's a mentality that's been lost that guys from the past have in greater quantity than guys have today in most cases. There's a few exceptions today, but I could say the same thing about like Kichimuto in Japan. Um, just like a kind of a way of conducting yourself as a top star because you came from an era where the competitiveness to be a top star was higher. The money was not as good unless you were a top guy. There was less guaranteed money for wrestlers. There was much more of a hustle required, and there was a lot more paranoia and insecurity about you losing that spot than I think there is today. And it's a healthier business today for sure, but I do think it forced the wrestlers of that era to become uh cognizant of their own star power and cognizant of their presence in the ring entertaining people in a way that a lot of people, even top guys today, don't have.
that's true, and probably the repetition of night after night, where you know newer wrestlers today, any wrestlers in AEW don't really get that. You're in the ring. I'm not gonna say like 7 days a week, but you're in the ring several days a week in different towns every night, and having to get over every night
And like
and being different people.
it being a baby face and being a heel is probably more complicated now than it was back then. And guys, turn a lot more than they used to. The idea of Sting basically being a baby face for pretty much his entire career. There are a few heel runs here and there that I think most people would say were bad and unnecessary. But just like the idea of being a completely career babyface, it's hard to think of somebody being like that today. Obviously, like John Cena was, but or Rey Mysterio. Um, but he, that's a different element too. And I just think that I don't know, it's something that's like lost by a lot of people today. Um, are there wrestlers who are active right now besides Sting who you think kind of have that quality?
Uh trying to think. No one Sting feels like an outlier in this case. I'm sure there are some names out there who would kind of
Yeah, I was
I don't know
I
whether
obviously just sprung this on you, and it's also my own perspective. So,
yeah, I
uh,
know someone like a Jeff Jarrett has a lot of
oh, interesting.
similar experiences to Sting. Though I think
Yeah,
Sting has exuded, yeah, I think Sting has more kind of natural star
yeah.
power
I
than a
wouldn't,
Jeff
I wouldn't,
Jarrett does.
yeah, I wouldn't put Jeff Jarrett in that class necessarily. I think when I think of Jarrett, I think of a guy who came up in like the territory era and came up in, the son of a successful promoter in the territory era. And as pretty much all of his peers have retired and died and gone away, he has these tricks that maybe were pretty standard when he was breaking into the business that stand out more today. Like he's the guy that's still working the old Tennessee style, and there's just nobody doing that today.
Yeah.
So, what's old is new again, especially when you're the only person doing it. So he kind of comes across as this unique entity. That's an interesting shout.
Yeah, just because he's been at it as long, pretty much as long as Sting and has a lot of
Yeah.
similar.
Like I think CM Punk carries himself like that.
Yeah, I think that's very true.
Yeah. And
CM Punk carries himself
I
like
think Roman now
a
does
few
that.
others. Yes, Roman. I'd say Roman now finally has, after
Right.
years and
Roman,
years of trying, has figured it out.
right. And it's a little bit different because he obviously came up in a totally different era, but Roman has a level of credibility having been pushed consistently and above everyone else for 10 plus years at this point where he just exudes that kind of what this guy does is important and that he is a top star. Whether you like what he's doing or not, I think that's pretty much indisputable. And I think one of the reasons that he's become such an important business mover for WWE in the last year or so uh, is because I think what he everything he does feels important and feels like he's a real big star. And I think he carries himself like that because
Yeah,
he's been groomed to be like that. I think Jericho carries himself like that to a degree, and I think MJF does. And MJF has way less experience and kind of years and decades of being on television and being presented as a big star. But I do think that he understands kind of that old school mentality uh, in how to project himself as a big star and how to carry himself. Um, and like in like Okada and Tanahashi too, it's a little bit different because they come from different business models in Japan where being a top star is in some ways kind of like the old model where it's harder to break into and they don't just pass the world title around to everyone. And I think in Japan it kind of stands out a little bit more because the business is in some ways still old fashioned compared to the weekly television model uh, that we see in like WWE and AEW.
yeah. I think Moxley carries himself, and maybe not in the star power way, but more of like he kind of having that aura of like, oh, something's gonna go down right now, probably because something pretty
Yeah,
much
it's
always
not.
does when
Yeah,
he gets in the ring.
yeah. Like even like I don't think Kenny carries himself. Kenny Omega carries himself like that, and it's nothing. It's not necessarily a knock against Kenny, who I think is obviously an incredible wrestler. It's just there's something about uh, and I don't even want to say it's confidence because Kenny is incredibly confident, so it's definitely not that. But it's it's I don't want to say it's selfishness because it's not a selfishness because I think someone like Chris Jericho is very giving while also doing that, and I think Sting is very giving too, but it is a cockiness and almost an arrogance and a understanding of I'm a big act and everyone is going to fall in line to what I want to do and what I'm doing, both in like a kayfabe sense and a non kayfabe sense. I guess if I were to describe it,
I
and
think, yeah, I think that makes sense.
yeah, and not every top guy today is going to have that and really if the business was filled with those kind of people because we'd still be in the old business where everyone was very paranoid and we'd have a lot more guys refusing to do jobs and using their creative control like that dastardly Hulk Hogan surely did
Mm-hmm.
at Starrcade 97. But I don't think it's something that like every wrestler inherently has. um and you kind of it's I think like I said it's been hammered home with Sting's performances and I hope he can get to 40 years. we were talking about this a little bit before the show, but he debuted in November of 1985. So he would need to get to 2025 to get to 40. He has talked a lot about retirement, and I'm pretty sure he's been talking about retirement since at least the late 90s. But he did mention, I think, in the after the Forbidden Door press, he was in the Forbidden Door press conference, and he said, you know, he isn't planning on retiring this year. So once he gets to 39 years, you might as well go for 40. But again, he's 64. He's probably realistically only one bad injury away from really calling it quits. And I would like to see Sting's last match be like good and not like, Ric Flair's last match, or something like that where it's kind of sad.
Yeah, you would hope that he would go out with some dignity, which is very very a big ask in the world of wrestling. I don't know, nothing really jumps out. I don't think. I mean, he could have a good match with with anyone, and not really anyone. I was gonna say his peer group, but he doesn't really have a lot of peers running around right now. But you hope he if he wants to, he can go to 40. I don't think he certainly needs to at this point. He certainly doesn't have a lot left to prove. He certainly made his money, and hopefully still has a good chunk of it. So yeah, hopefully, if he wants to, he gets to 40 and has a good last match, and hopefully AEW would make it a big deal.
Yeah, and I think like the Muto final bye bye, the Muto retirement tour was really successful from a drawing perspective and from a business perspective. And it got people talking about like what kind of retirement tour, like who's the next wrestler, who's a wrestler in America that could do something similar to what the Muto retirement tour was. And it feels like the only case is really Sting as a guy that would have kind of multi-generational appeal. And I'm really interested in seeing if AEW chooses to pursue that, if they can get an agreement with, okay, your last match is going to be on X date, and maybe, I don't know if they'll run a stadium show or something like that, or they run like a big arena in Atlanta or in WCW country or something like that. But to kind of put together a real retirement tour for a guy like that, because we seen that in the United States, like a obviously like in Japan there's like the everyone remembers like the Inoki the Final Countdown, and obviously this Muto one, but have we seen kind of a similar tour like that in America where it's kind of promoted, these are the last few matches over like the course of a year? Have we seen that in America
For retirement, nothing
for like a
comes to
major
mind.
star?
Yeah, I mean, I still remember when Samoa Joe left Ring of Honor, they did like a bunch of series of matches for him and made it like, all right, he's wrestling this guy for the last time. It's not the same thing, but it's along those same lines that came to mind. As far as, I mean, wrestlers always kind of come back. So, I think retirement tours are certainly met with skepticism, but I'm sure there may be an obvious example, but nothing's really coming to mind right now. I mean,
Yeah,
you had
probably back in the territory days there was.
yeah,
I'm thinking.
I think there was like stuff like Fritz von Erich would have like a comeback match or something like that, something along those lines. But I don't, wrestlers kind of, I don't know if they call it quits like a bit earlier now than they did now. Like it's so funny. Like we talked about the Legion of Doom, and I remember they made like old jokes about like Hawk and Animal when they were 40 in 1997, and no one blinks. If there's a 40-year-old wrestler shows up on like Raw, like no one blinks an eye. Like, well, yeah, of course, that's just kind of how it is. So
Well, it was
I don't
like
really know.
Randy Savage was. Vince thought Randy Savage was like getting too old in like the early '90s when he was like, I don't know, like 39 years old.
Oh yeah, yeah. And I remember like Ric Flair lost the title to Sting, and I remember the aftermath. Like, well, that's it for Ric Flair as a world champion, and then he won like more world championships than he held before he was 40, like after he was 40. So just kind of, yeah, the Ric Flair retirement's kind of just jumping in my mind as kind of a big retirement thing, but it's not really something wrestling has done.
Like the most recent Ric Flair retirement,
Yeah, yeah.
which was successful given that it was like an indie show.
Oh, absolutely. No, they deserve a ton of credit for the. I mean, I don't. It was sad and not good, but as
Yeah,
far
I
as
thought it
business
was
goes, they deserve a
I
ton of credit.
yeah, I thought it was like exploitive, but it was successful from a business perspective. And think about what you could do with Sting's not the level of star that Ric Flair is, but Sting has never had a retirement like Ric Flair, and Sting certainly can do more physically in the ring than Ric Flair. And Sting is in a major wrestling company that can promote the hell out of it. I mean, they did a good job. The Conrad, show did a good job given what they had at their disposal, but they didn't have a national television show, and they didn't have a regular touring roster of wrestlers or things like that. You could do something really big with Sting. And it could mean something, and it could be really unique, I think, to like American wrestling to see this, and makes people feel good about an old wrestler, which is pretty hard because we're in a society where old wrestlers die young, they go broke, or they're physically ravaged. And it would actually be pretty heartwarming, I think, to see a guy go out on top on his own terms, still performing at a respectable level. And obviously there's a lot of smoke and mirrors involved with his current performance. He's wrestling mostly, I think he's wrestled exclusively tag matches. He's not taking a ton of bumps. He's taking some memorable ones, but he's not taking an enormous amount of them. But you could get away with this. It seems like you could get away with this formula for a few more years, but it would be really nice, I think, to see something set up like that. I mean, as a lifelong Sting skeptic, I would be very intrigued to see that.
Yeah, that would be nice. I don't know, like who you sub for opponents. Do you see if you call Goldberg for that? Because I think you run that in like WCW country as kind of a final coda on that portion of his career. Do you do a big AEW singles opponent and all that, and run that, and you kind of run through the different facets of Sting's career that way? That would be different and interesting, and probably lucrative for AEW.
You have a lot of like the TNA wrestlers he wrestled in
yeah.
TNA at your disposal. Yeah, you could do a lot. I mean, you could bring in. There's got to be wrestlers from Japan he probably clashed with. I know, like they did the whole thing with Muto. I like the idea of Sting, like Muto. Sting's talk. This definitely probably didn't happen, but I've like to imagine that like Sting is talking to Muto about this tag match, and he's like, "Yeah, we'll do a 6-man tag, and I'll bring this guy Darby Allin with me. Don't worry, Muto. He's gonna take every bump. We don't have to do anything." And then like Darby just comes in and takes like 600 crazy bumps while Muto and Sting do like nothing but soak up the glory. It's like a hypothetical conversation that probably didn't happen, but it warms my heart to think that it did.
Yeah, no, that's probably some very, very close to reality.
All right. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about that we didn't get to?
No, I think we did. We covered all of the facets of Sting, all the good and the less good, but certainly the high note he's on right now. So no, I think we did a good job.
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely someone who I think his like Q rating in wrestling is probably really high, which is very impressive given the industry that he's in, and he was a top star forever. Usually those people are not universally popular, but seems to be like among his peers, he's pretty well respected.
I would say so. Do you think Sting is more popular than, or has more a higher Q rating, I guess, than the Crow movie that he took his look from? Because it seems like Sting has endured a lot more than that franchise has.
Interesting. Yes. I've never seen The Crow. When I was in college, like my friend talked about The Crow, which is more conversations in college I had than conversations about Sting, which was with nobody. But
yeah,
I mean, The Crow is pretty. Like, I don't think if was it Brandon Lee? Is that
it was Brandon Lee? Yes.
Yeah. So if Brandon Lee doesn't die, I don't think anyone remembers The Crow, or maybe they do because Brandon Lee becomes a huge star after that.
Great soundtrack too, but yeah.
The Crow was it like a graphic novel or comic book?
Before? Yeah, it was based on I think a pretty underground comic at the time.
Yeah, so it's really, The Crow is really ahead of its time in terms of like comic book or like this kind of cult classic thing being turned into a movie. Like if that comes out in 2018, I don't know if it would endure further. It's an interesting question. Like I know what The Crow is, and I couldn't tell you what many movies were from 1994, wherever that came out. So that's probably that might be an interesting poll question. Might be skewered by it being answered exclusively by wrestling fans on my social
Probably,
media.
yes, that would cast a wider net for the
But yeah, I mean that does bring up an interesting idea of like Sting's, you know, most identifiable look. He blatantly stole from popular media at the time. Uh, and nobody really cared. And I don't know if it would be the same if someone did that today, but maybe someone should try to do that today
yeah, I think
because
it was
probably get
I
over.
was yeah, at the time it was so nuts that this guy was changing his look that he had established for like pretty much a decade on national television, and kind of changing his look was just something you never thought would happen. People kind of pointed it out like, oh yeah, it's the Crow, but I don't think anyone got really upset about it. I think it was just like more like, okay, he looks pretty cool, and like this is a big deal. So I think that's as far as people's caring went.
And he's changed elements of it, so it's not like
Yeah,
straight up. It looks a little bit different. He went to the Joker Sting phase, which again is him just lifting something from popular media at the time. Um, I thought it was dumb, but I think it was also hugely successful for him as Joker Sting.
yeah, it worked for a bit in TNA. So
Yeah,
yeah,
it was during a time period where I think I was jokered out in terms of everything being the
yes,
Joker, like in the wake of the Dark Knight. But was is another example of someone lifting something from popular current media, uh, and doing that. I wonder, but you don't see that really in wrestling. And like if you go back to the '80s, that happened all the time. Like we were talking about the Road Warriors, and their look is really just lifted from various like cyberpunk or dystopian movies that were popular at the time, including their name, the Road Warriors. Um, I don't know, you don't see that much people ripping that off in wrestling. You don't see as much people ripping off current pop culture in wrestling, and maybe they should because things that are popular or in other mediums might be popular in a pro wrestling sense.
yeah. I mean, you like Jason the Terrible or the Lord Humongous or thing. I mean, I don't know. People are more litigious these days, given everything's on national television, and people didn't really care if he was just like in some territory in the '80s. Probably wouldn't care as much. I don't know, but yeah, no, that's gone by the wayside.
Yeah. I guess AAA has like the Marvel superhero characters.
Yeah, but that's in conjunction with Marvel as kind
Right.
of a. It's not like they're like, oh,
And,
Spider-Man. That sounds good.
and frankly, that would like suck if like WWE or AEW just had like, yeah, this guy's Wolverine, and he came out with like the full on Wolverine costume. Like, even
Yeah,
though
no, that would be
Wolverine is
bad.
cool, like I just don't think it would work.
Yeah, it was like the Kiss Demon in WCW. It was like
Well, it can't be too marketed, uh,
no,
like
no.
that. But yeah, but I don't know, looks that are it's more like stealing a look or something, which I guess some people do. I think Will Ospreay stole like the Logan Paul, Jake Paul look.
Maybe they can have a boxing match over there.
Yeah, and then ironically, Logan Paul would end up joining wrestling, so he's kind
Yeah.
of
Huh.
copied Will Ospreay. They'll probably have a match one day. Maybe not. I have no idea.
Oh, I don't know. I wouldn't bet against it. It probably will happen at some point.
Yeah, it would have to involve. Would have to probably involve Will Ospreay signing with WWE,
Mm.
which would be interesting. But anyway, thanks a lot, Joe, for being on the show. You have any final words for the listeners at home?
No. Appreciate everyone tuning in. It was great to be on this. I had a great time. And I'll just drop a plug for the Five Star Match Game. That is a show right here on the Voices of Wrestling Podcasting Network. It is a trivia podcast. I take three guests and we play trivia and keep score, and it's a lot of fun. And we have about 36 episodes done. They're all pretty evergreen. You can find them in the archives. There will be a topic you will enjoy, whether fan of AEW, WWE, older wrestling, Lucha, Japan. We've covered a bunch. So, and maybe I'll do an episode on Sting someday. We just did one on Bret Hart. Our first show on a singular wrestler. It went well. So maybe the Stinger certainly had a long career to justify that. So perhaps that will be down the line.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Joe. I appreciate you for being on the show. Appreciate all our listeners as always. Uh, Anyone has any comments or questions, please feel free to leave them in the comment section or yell at me on social media. I always encourage that kind of behavior. Maybe I shouldn't, but I do. So thanks a lot, everyone, and I'll talk to you again in a while.